Hi, thank you all for being here today, and thank you for being here and braving the weather to be here because it is cold out there. And I understand one of my coworkers said, well, we've had all 4 seasons this week in Knoxville. And since I live in Nashville City, I think we kind of did in Nashville too. But so thank you all for being here today. It's really an honor to be here, so thank you for having me and to be able to talk about this topic that has become so important to me. And I think building off what Mark said, my practice experience as a social worker was in San Antonio, Texas, in addition to working with families in Central America. So I really worked with immigrant families on both sides of the border that led to my passion for not only gaining a deeper understanding of immigration and how as a social worker we can provide better services, but also trying to educate for the provider community and other social workers and just help us to all understand immigration from Latin America better. I have just a couple of objectives that I hope will come across today. One is to gain insight into trauma exposure throughout the migration process. One is to recognize resilience among Latino immigrants and to understand the impact of immigration on well-being. Why are we talking about Latino immigration in Tennessee? One is now 5% of our residents in Tennessee are Latino. And there has been a substantial growth in the Latino population between 2000 and 2014. We were the state with the second fastest growing Latino community. 43% of Latinos in Tennessee are immigrants. The majority of adults are immigrants. The majority of youth are U.S. citizens, native-born U.S. citizens. However, nearly half of these youth live in poverty. Only 85% have health insurance. And this 15%, there are a couple of reasons that 15% lack health insurance. Some of that is that some Latino youth are immigrants and can't legally access health insurance. They don't have access to Medicaid, and their parents aren't able to work legally to provide work-based health insurance. Another proportion of this 15% are U.S. citizens, but their parents may not have legal status in the United States and may fear signing up the child for health insurance because that brings attention to them and could increase risk of arrest and deportation. And as we know, Tennessee has not historically been sensitive to immigrants. And I will make a note as I'm using a picture that I did pay so that we know the ethics, so we're talking about morality and ethics, but yes, I did pay for the rights for Tennessee welcomes you, but again, we know Tennessee is not always welcoming with immigrants. Immigration offers opportunities and stressors and improves economic well-being and safety for immigrants who come to the United States, and also economic well-being back home. And as an example, many immigrants send what are called remittances or parts of their wages to family members in the home country. And these remittances have raised households out of poverty, have raised whole communities out of poverty, and in some cases have increased the gross domestic product of whole countries pretty substantially. So remittances can make a difference between the well-being and survival of family members back home who may need surgery or need medication for a chronic medical condition. However, the immigration process also exposes both adults and youth to trauma, to hardships and trauma that can have an impact on health and well-being. The migration process, we're going to look at it today in terms of 3 stages. The pre-migration stage is a time period in one's home country before they start the immigration journey. The migration stage is the actual journey, and post-migration begins once somebody arrives in the destination country, such as the United States. This picture was taken on the outskirts of Tegucigalpa, which is the capital city of Honduras. Tegucigalpa is one of the most dangerous non-war cities worldwide right now. It's a beautiful city. I've spent a good amount of time in Tegucigalpa. And some of the stressors, such as those that we'll talk about in cities like Tegucigalpa, are what push people to migrate to the United States. Most of the migration from Latin America is from Mexico, and then also from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Together, these countries are known as the Northern Triangle region of Central America. And we'll talk a little bit more about what's going on in these three countries that prompts immigration north. Central American immigrants have to travel illegally through Mexico to reach the U.S. border. So there's a good amount of risk traveling through Mexico of violence and of being deported before even reaching the U.S. border. Almost 2 years ago, Nicaragua, which had been really stable and safe for a number of years, Nicaragua had increased unrest and has increased rates of violence now over the past 2 years. Nicaraguans are also migrating, but as we can see, that would be a pretty long trip to head north. So Nicaraguans tend to migrate more south to Costa Rica. I spent a month in Costa Rica this summer and learned a good amount about the immigration from Nicaragua and met a large number of Nicaraguan immigrants in Costa Rica. So thinking about life in Mexico and Central America, I'm really going to be focusing on a lot of hardships and stressors. And so I want to also recognize the strengths of this region of the world. And some key strengths are the family and community connections and support. And those tend to lead to lower rates of isolation. And that can be a really hard process of moving to the United States, coming from a culture that is less individualistic to our culture, which has higher individualism and also can have higher rates of isolation. There are also rich cultural traditions in the families and communities. I know when I've spent time in Central America, there tend to be a lot of festivals, a lot of community-based events. There are also historical strengths such as safety in smaller communities, especially in rural communities. There historically has been a great deal of safety and sense of community in smaller towns and rural areas. And then there's also just a more interconnected nature of people being outside, fewer people driving, more people walking. And we can see that in this picture, which was taken in Honduras in 2006. I was spending time volunteering in a boys' home in a really rural, remote area of Honduras for 6 months in 2006. And this was a community that I would take a bus to get supplies, to buy produce. And this was a typical scene in this community where people were out and about. There were opportunities for me to engage and just get to know some of the community members there. And again, it's that communal versus individualistic nature that can be such a strength in Central America and Mexico. This is another beauty of the region, another strength of the region. And there's a great deal of biodiversity and beauty in these countries. This top picture was taken in Costa Rica in a cloud forest and with this stunning rainbow. At some parts of the day, there were 2 rainbows there, and the bottom picture was taken in Nicaragua. There are also, in addition to the beauty, there are a number of hardships that push immigrants north to the United States. And these can include poverty, poor access to education and health care, natural disasters, and violence. I want to focus on this slide a little bit on the poor access to education and health care, and then we'll look at the remaining 3 points on this slide after that. So poor access to education, there can be several reasons for that. And particularly in rural communities, there may be situations where the parents need the child to stay home and work. So going to school may not be a really feasible option for the family, especially in a rural agricultural community. The family may more urgently need the money. There are other times that the closest school may be a mile from home. So on days like today, if it's raining, if it's bad weather, maybe it's just not a path that a child wants to walk that day, or a path that parents want to send their child on when there's bad weather. In some rural areas, there may not be enough teachers, or teachers may not show up every day. So education can be a little bit harder to access. This is also the case for healthcare. Healthcare in the main hospitals in the cities is often not cheap. So individuals in rural communities have to ride a bus, so they have to pay for transportation to get to the city, and to pay, and then to pay for the services once they're in the city to access the hospital services. In the smaller communities are oftentimes also health clinics, and in these health clinics, the provider, maybe a doctor or nurse, may show up once a week, but sometimes the provider doesn't show up. And I saw this in Nicaragua in a rural community where they have a socialist healthcare system, and the nurse was to show up 1 or 2 days a week at the clinic that was present in this rural community. But the community members said, oftentimes we go to the clinic on the day that someone should be there and nobody shows up. So the services aren't always available, which leads individuals, again, to have to pay for transportation to go to the city and then pay for additional the services as well. Yes.
Can we interrupt with questions?
Absolutely, yes.
On the education, of course, we're in a kind of different environment here, and we see education as being something that maybe it's not in the places that you're talking about. And I wonder, if the youth that are to be educated, are they getting an education that's relevant to where they live, or is it more like our education, which in many cases is more theoretical, kind of background and things that maybe aren't so useful on a day-to-day basis? Can you mention a few things about
Sure. I think it varies. I think it varies substantially from country to country in Central America, and I'm going to speak more to Central America because that's where my experience is, and from location within countries. For example, I've spent most of my time in Central America and Honduras, and I've seen in the cities some really nice public schools, and in rural communities I've seen situations where multiple grades are attending class with one teacher, and they're teaching the basics of math, science, Spanish, language skills, language arts, so to speak. But it really varies, and oftentimes I think that the education does not necessarily apply to skills that someone will be able to use long term, but that can happen more so in the city, I think, than in rural communities. But again, I hate to give a blanket statement on that because it really can vary substantially based on the school, who's teaching in the school. Sometimes we may have Peace Corps volunteers who are teaching in the school, so we may have that lens coming into the school, a lens from the United States, or there may be a community where it's harder to get anyone to come in and teach. So there may be someone with less education trying to cover all of the subjects.
I asked the question because when we, like in this room, hear the word education, we probably have a very different idea about what education is than somebody from a different country.
To some degree, but they're still covering the main topic areas that we think about. So when immigrant youth move to the United States and transition into our school systems, they are able to transition because they have still taken science and math and some of the same subjects. Yeah, great question, thank you. So moving on to poverty, we can see here the poverty rates in Central America and Mexico are high. Interestingly, El Salvador is a bit lower than the other countries in this list in Central America. And one of the reasons for the high rates of poverty is lack of jobs. There's simply oftentimes, especially in rural communities, not enough jobs for the individuals who live there. So for example, the community that I was in Honduras, and again this was many years ago in 2006, the only employment option was agriculture. So not everybody in the community could get a job in agriculture. So that could be a really big challenge. There just weren't enough jobs. And for individuals who moved to the cities, sometimes the cities were overwhelmed with individuals from rural communities looking for work. So there wasn't enough work in the cities either. So the only way to find employment that could sustain a family was to migrate. high poverty, lack of jobs leads to food insecurity and has an impact on meeting basic needs. In my dissertation research with families in Texas, with immigrant families in Texas, one of the recurring themes that came up was that individuals, when they did work in, for example, in agriculture, they may get paid, or depending on the community, they may be given food instead of a paycheck. So then maybe food insecurity isn't a problem, but then there's not the funds to meet other basic needs. A major concern has been the impact of weather on poverty. And weather is natural disasters in particular hit Central America hard. It's one of the regions that is particularly hit. And we can think about it, I'm not a climatologist, but I would say geographically, one of the things that we can see is that Central America is a narrower strip of land. So if we have a hurricane come through, for example, there's less to slow down the hurricane before it hits land. There are also high rates of drought and flooding in Latin America, and in particular in Central America. Just last year, 80% of corn and bean crops were decimated by drought in Honduras. And if we think about the Honduran staple foods, beans and corn are two of the staple foods in Honduras. So not only does that impact what food is available in the country, it also impacts the ability to work. So it impacts the earnings as well. These are two houses and pictures that I took in rural Central America in similar communities. And I want to draw attention here because I'd mentioned remittances and money that is sent back home by immigrant family members. And I think these two homes can really highlight what immigration can do for families in the home country. This picture, would not withstand a natural disaster. We can see that that home would be destroyed by a hurricane. I'm going to guess that this family does not have or at least when I took the picture, did not have an immigrant family member. Because if they had family in the United States who were sending money, and so often family members do, they would be able to build a safer home. This home is built with cinder blocks, with rebar in the cinder blocks, and then concrete poured on top of the rebar in the cinder blocks. This home will withstand a natural disaster. Most likely, these homes have been shown to be able to withstand hurricanes and natural disasters. My guess is that this family does have an immigrant member in the United States based on where I took the picture. Yes.
A friend of mine is involved with Habitat
Yes.
for
So
Humanity, and some of the pictures he showed me look very much like
yes.
that. Do they have much of an impact?
They do. Yeah, great question. So Habitat for Humanity also builds, that's actually how I knew how the house was built, because I've done some of the habitat work in Central America as well. And this picture where I took it was not an area where Habitat was working at the time, which is why I believe that they had an immigrant family member. But absolutely, that's exactly how Habitat builds homes throughout Central America so that they are safer and can withstand the natural disasters. Yeah, thank you, great question. Contributing to the poverty, as I mentioned, is lack of jobs. And I wanted to share one story from a research participant who explained why she sends remittances back home to her family. And she said that her family member took a job that was an hour and a half from home because that was the best job that the family member could find, and had to pay bus fare to and from work each day, and had a 3-hour round trip each day. The conditions were poor. The days were 12 hours with no lunch or official break, and there were 3 days of work in a week and then 4 days off, and those 4 days off were required. There was just work available for those 3 days. And the pay was poor. It was about $57 a week. And while that does not translate exactly, of course, to $57 in the United States, it is still not a substantial amount of money for a good life, for economic well-being in Central America.
That's surprising. I would have thought that would have been a good salary.
Yeah, it depends. That's a good point. Yeah, so it depends on how many family members are being supported with that income. Yeah, thanks. The violence is a major crisis in Central America right now, and these are the top countries on the grim list of the highest number of homicides per capita worldwide. And we can see that El Salvador is the top of that list, followed by Honduras, but all three Northern Triangle countries are on this list. So we know that violence is extreme in Central America. One of the reasons is the gang activity, which relates to the drug trade in Central America. And gang membership can be forced, especially on adolescents. So both males and females can be forced to join gangs. Females can also be forced to become a significant other of gang members, and refusal to join a gang can endanger individuals' lives and the lives of their family members. There was a video that I almost showed today, but wanted to be sensitive to time of an adolescent in El Salvador, and I would be happy to share that with anyone who is interested, who tells his story of the requirement or the pressure to join a gang, and he ultimately refused with his parents' support, but his father was ultimately killed because he was not willing to join the gang. The same adolescent did try to come to the United States, but didn't make it through Mexico to reach the border.
I wondered, do you have the homicides for the United States for comparison?
I don't know that right off the top of my head, but so I don't know that. Does anybody know that figure right off? Oh, Mark's going to use the magic of Google to help us find out. Thank you.
Praise Google.
That's homicides per year, isn't it? So over a 10-year period, you would have maybe getting close to, in El Salvador, close to 1%.
Yeah, it's
Wow.
high. Yeah, it's substantial. Yeah.
But these numbers are from 2012, is that right?
These numbers.
That says 7.
No, I'm sorry. So no, these numbers are not. This is relevant to these two posts instead. So this is actually more recent. Yeah, this is 17. For women, one of the greatest risks for violence is domestic violence. I couldn't find a recent number from Honduras for domestic violence, but just over 27% of Guatemalan women reported that they've experienced domestic violence, and 26% of Salvadoran women. I'll keep going, but when you have that figure, I welcome that.
Wikipedia, if we want to trust it.
Yeah, please.
Says it's 5 per 100,000.
Great.
In 2018.
Great.
But Wikipedia.
Thank you. Thank you, social workers. Yes.
Before we move on to past pre-migration, I'm curious, there's a lot of talk about how American geopolitical policies have influenced some of these factors that contribute to pre-migration. I'm wondering if you've researched, how connected is that, especially in the 70s, 80s, 90s policies, state building efforts, things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and really beyond my focus as a social worker, so I want to put that caveat out there, but there is the belief that there is a direct influence, and then there's also, in addition to that, in the early 2000s, as the drug trade had moved more into Mexico, and we as the United States helped support Mexico in fighting the drug war as a border country, that did push the gang activity and drug trade south into Central America, where the governments aren't as stable, where they have less ability to combat that. Yeah, thanks. Any other questions on pre-migration before? Great. Okay, we'll talk now about the migration journey, and based on the stressors in the home country that prompts the journey to the United States. And this journey, depending on how somebody travels, it can last weeks. Sometimes, I just met a family last week who said, no, we were able to travel in a car or by the trains most of the way. Other people from Central America will ride trains through Mexico or have to walk a good portion of the trip. So it can be a really long trip depending on the path that somebody takes to reach the US border. There's several stressors that are associated again with the migration journey. So not only have individuals endured likelihood of violence or witnessing violence and poverty in the home country, enough stress that they made the decision either individually or that the family made the decision together for one member to migrate to the United States, but then there's additional stress on the journey. There also can be substantial violence, and that can be especially the case for Central Americans traveling through Mexico, is that there is still gang activity in Mexico, even though some of it has moved south. There is still gang activity in Mexico, and Central Americans, as I mentioned, must travel illegally through Mexico. So Central Americans face the risk of deportation throughout the trip in Mexico as well. There's exposure to environmental elements that we'll look at, lack of adequate supplies, and risk of injury and illness. The two paths for crossing into the United States are often the Sonoran Desert or the Rio Grande River, and both paths are very dangerous. The desert in particular during the summer can reach temperatures of around 129 degrees Fahrenheit. They also, as we can see, there's not a lot of shade, as we know, in the desert. There are insects, snakes, animals, plants that maybe aren't life-threatening but can prick the skin, can be very aggravating. And as I mentioned, oftentimes people can't take enough supplies. So individuals may be traveling without enough food, without enough water, and may be weaker, dehydrated, which increases risk not only of illness, but also injury, tripping, injuring themselves along the way. Also crossing the Rio Grande River, this is a picture, a stock picture. So this is a picture that's a more narrow part of the river, but the parts that individuals are going to cross for immigration are going to be the more isolated parts. Mm-hmm.
How do individuals or families get enough money to start the journey at all? I mean, I don't suspect that one day somebody gets up and says, I'm heading for the U.S., and they have $1 in their pocket.
You're exactly right. Families oftentimes plan well in advance, so that's what I mentioned before. It can be an individual decision, but oftentimes it is a family decision, so that even extended family members will help contribute to hiring a guide or a coyote to guide someone across the border to help avoid the violence and the risks that are associated with the travel. So this is a process that takes time for individuals to raise the money. So usually once an immigrant arrives, the remittances that are sent back initially are to pay off the loans. And then over time, the remittances can be used to improve food security, access to health care, and other basic needs. So yes, it is oftentimes a family decision that involves more than just the immediate family living in the household, but the extended family. And that can be one of the responsibilities of sending remittances, not just to an immediate family, but to extended family, to cousins, to nieces and nephews. Yeah, thanks, good question. So both paths are dangerous to cross. On average, just under 300 immigrants are known to die every year trying to reach the U.S. border. Those are the immigrants that we know about. That's where we find the remains of immigrants, and we do not know the exact number, and that's almost impossible to ascertain. There are people trying to figure that out and to get a better estimate, but that's very hard to determine. A quote from a provider here in Tennessee who was sharing a story of one of her Latino immigrant clients. It said that she, who was a mother, came with her little kids, so the water she had she gave to them, and she would drink from basically mud to keep from dehydrating. And that's not an unusual situation of not, again, having enough supplies for the journey. Post-migration, once somebody does make that journey, which is, again, a treacherous journey that can involve a number of hardships, and arrives at the U.S. border, they are here seeking the dream of being in El Norte, or the North, here in the United States. Again, after enduring trauma in the home country and during the journey, there are more stressors that are endured here in the United States. One is language barriers, cultural differences and barriers, loss and grief, and discrimination and fear. And we'll look at most of these. I do want to share that loss and grief has been found to have such a profound impact that even when controlling for other factors, the experience of loss and grief can mirror symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. That alone can, because leaving everything behind. And we'll look at that in a little more detail. This was a study, the data were collected in 2014 and 2015 in Tennessee. And these were the post-migration stressors that were reported. And over 50% of the participants in the study reported language barriers, which is not surprising, family separation and loss, cultural barriers, and discrimination. And what we know since the study is that family separation has taken a bit of a different angle with some of our recent immigration policies and the separation at the border, and then also with the risk of deportation, increased numbers of workplace raids, and the number of individuals who are being arrested in workplace raids, and the risk of parents being deported. Oftentimes, for example, the raid in Bean Station that happened in April of 2018, the parents who were arrested, most of their children were U.S. citizens. Some of the families I met with had been in the United States, the parents had for 18 to 20 years. They were not willing to take their children back to Central America due to the violence. So if they were deported, it would be a permanent separation unless the parents could get back to the United States. So family separation has taken a bit of a different angle since this study was completed. A study with providers, again here in Tennessee, showed a few themes that were different than some of those reported by immigrants. One was lack of insurance, which of course leads to a lack of ability to easily access health or mental health or other services. Lack of transportation was another big concern from providers, that individuals are possibly driving without a driver's license to be able to get their kids to school, or to be able to get their kids to appointments, or to attend other activities, or just to go to the grocery store, so that there's a lot of risk around legal transportation. And when public transportation isn't an option, that can be especially trying. And then not knowing the U.S. law, and we're going to look at that a bit on the next slide, and not understanding the U.S. system. And one example I have here is schools. And one of the examples around schools is that in some parts of Central America, if a parent were to go to the school and start asking questions, which we often do in the United States, parents may go and want to know, hey, how's my kid doing? What are they learning? Are they understanding this teaching method? Or my kid has these specific needs in the classroom, that approaching a teacher or approaching school administration can be seen as disrespectful and challenging to the school, so that the lens may be the parent's territory is the home, and the school is the teachers' and administrators' territory. So that can be a different system and cultural norm that may not translate well to working in schools in the United States. If I'm teaching, or I'm a school social worker, and I think, wow, I guess if the parents aren't here, maybe they just don't care how their kid is doing in school, which may be completely opposite of the truth. In terms of varying laws and enforcement, this was an image that I saw in much of one of my trips to Central America, and finally I decided to take a picture and block out the faces, because I really wanted to use this as an example of how the legal system can look different. And I'm not going to even say that that's legal in any part of Central America. I don't know what the law is, but what you see here is that a young child who cannot fully wrap his arms around a father's waist is on the back of a motorcycle. And if we saw that in the United States, I think we would expect, that they're going to probably get pulled immediately. As a social worker, if I saw that, I would probably have a responsibility to call Child Protective Services. I would be very concerned for that child's safety. Again, this was something that I saw routinely. It was very accepted, and it wasn't to put the children in danger, of course, and the parents weren't usually going fast on a motorcycle, but it was still an accepted means of slower transportation in a smaller community. And that may be something that feels very normal, very culturally appropriate. And that is an extreme example, but one example of moving to the United States and not understanding the systems, but also maybe not knowing all of the laws and learning the hard way in some situations.
You're gonna hate me. We do that here. As long as
That?
Yeah, as long as we're not on a highway or something. If we're on a highway, it's in front of us.
I need to make a phone call. No, I'm kidding.
Sorry.
I'm just, okay. Anyway, we might talk afterwards. Okay.
We need to anyway.
We need to. Okay, great.
I did a lot of social work.
Great, thank you. Learning English, I want to bring this one up too, because we can think as somebody lives here, it can be kind of easy to learn English. And I will tell you, when I spent 6 months in Honduras and I was in a rural, remote community, I would have thought I would have walked away fully fluent in Spanish. What happened was there were 2 German volunteers there and they didn't speak Spanish. And they wanted to talk a whole lot in English. So I was using a whole lot of English throughout that 6 months on the trip. And I had a Belgian friend that I traveled with on the weekends. She didn't speak any Spanish, so I was using way more English than I had hoped. But in this situation, we can see, this is again a provider report of her client in Tennessee saying that, well, yeah, a lot of people are working 12 to 14-hour days and are surrounded by people at home who speak Spanish, at work who speak Spanish, and they can't attend the English classes when they're offered, or maybe even, if that's not the case, maybe they get off a long day of work and want to be home with their children instead of saying, okay, and now I'm going to go to English class. So learning English, even here in the United States, can be very difficult. It also can be terrifying and embarrassing to try to navigate a culture or a society without speaking the language.
As a social worker looking at that problem, do you have any advice, any solutions for those people?
I would love to see English classes offered in settings such as schools or settings where parents can engage with their youth at the same time and make it more of a community-based event.
But that still doesn't address the 12 to 14.
The 12 to 14-hour days, yeah. That would take us into more of a policy conversation and about policies around legalization of work. So that would definitely take us into a whole nother conversation, but I would be happy to talk about that, yeah, after the presentation as well. Thanks. Yeah, because my solutions to that are going to be much, much broader. I think on a smaller level, yes, with the long work days, but if there were a Saturday in a school system, and some schools are starting to try to offer more services to immigrant parents and to incorporate community-based interventions instead of the individualistic interventions and offer services to youth and parents at the same time. So I think that could be one small approach within the system that we're working with right now.
As part of their immigrant community, is there any religious involvement that they maintain?
Absolutely, absolutely. There are, and I'm going to know less about Knoxville since I live in Nashville, but also I do know that there are services here in Spanish in Knoxville and churches, and certainly in Nashville we have a good number of churches that have services in Spanish as well. So,
But does that keep them from learning English then, because the service is in Spanish?
Yeah.
Or is there some like before on a Sunday, because I'm going to guess that they don't work 7 days a week, 12
Right.
14 hours a day, but I could be wrong.
no, I
So
don't
they
think
have
that's the
this
case.
day
Yeah.
off, and they may
Yeah.
go to a church, and then after church, are there ESL classes or anything like that?
Good question. Some churches do have ESL classes, so I think that would be another option. One of the things I've found just trying to conduct research on Sundays at churches is that oftentimes after church, again, people want to go home with their family. Yeah, that's kind of the family day. But I think that there are alternatives that I think could be addressed. Yeah.
If you go over on North Central to the Catholic Church on Saturday afternoons, they are absolutely packed with Latinos, full families. You cannot get in. That their devotion to Catholicism and their family life is really impressive.
Yeah. Again, a huge strength of the community. Yeah.
Yeah, just an example, our church, for the rest of us, has mission Spanish that it teaches every Sunday.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that could be another option. Yeah, is English and the.
We Concord Methodist.
Great. Thank you all.
By a former UT professor.
Yeah.
Oh, even better. Great. So I don't know, kind of coming back to the terrifying and embarrassing, I don't know if people have traveled internationally and been in a country where they don't speak, where you don't speak the language, it can be really tough to try to navigate life in that country or try to navigate even a trip in another country in that situation. It's also isolating. One of the things I found the first time I went to Central America, I was a teenager, and I remember the family I was staying with feeling like I had no personality because I couldn't communicate with them. I didn't speak Spanish, and I kept thinking, they must think I'm just like the quietest, most boring person sitting staring at them all day or looking around because I couldn't communicate well with them. So it was very isolating to me to be just in their home, and I was there with a group. I had plenty of other people to speak to in English. And then the role of children. We often see children are learning English in the schools, and so they can serve as interpreters, which there are pros and cons to that. I'll start with the cons. Some of the challenges is we don't want children to interpret in situations that are beyond their developmental stage. We don't want young children talking with bill collectors or interpreting for a serious medical condition for their parents. There can also be a strength in this. If I think of an adolescent who's helping their parents through interpretation at meetings or other situations such as grocery store or other situations, then that adolescent may have a really vital and meaningful role in the family that could help with self-esteem, that could help with self-identity, and may help serve as a strength and form of resilience for the adolescent. I mentioned the loss before. These are some quotes. This one was actually from a provider who was explaining the situation of what she hears from clients. I always feel like I'm substituting ingredients, like you're never getting the purest version of who I am. This is from an immigrant participant here in Tennessee. There are times when I do think, will it be worth it? That my children haven't grown up with their grandparents, that my children haven't grown up with their cousins, with their uncles. I've asked myself that question several times. Another quote from an immigrant participant here in Tennessee: my parents passed away. It will be 3 years since my mom passed, and the biggest pain was not being able to go, because this was a participant who did not have documented status, so of course could not travel home to be with her mom when her mom was sick and dying, because she may not have been able to come back here where her kids are. There also is a great deal of fear, as I think many of us know, among the Latino community right now. And an example of this, these are all provider quotes on this slide. This one is from a provider in Tennessee speaking about immigrant clients. You cannot build anything, and again, this is specific for undocumented immigrants. You're always scared that can be taken away. That might be a relationship, that might be a house, that might be your job, because of your legal situation, so people live in constant fear. Another quote, this is from a provider in Texas speaking about one of her clients. I'm not going to renew my child's Medicaid because I don't want to be found. The provider further explained, and yet this child has severe medical issues. And this final quote is also from a provider in Texas saying, I don't want to live in fear that tomorrow I'm going to get picked up while my kids are in school. So this provider again was explaining this is what her clients are telling her. Kind of a summary of the fear. This is actually out of a song. The Gold Cage is a song that was written by immigrants to explain the undocumented immigrant situation here in the United States. And the song really touches on there's everything here. It's like gold, everything is here, but I can't leave. So it's like this cage. And this is a provider explaining, summarizing the song for me. It's like this cage made out of gold, and you have all these amenities and all these wonderful things, but you're caged in because if you leave, you can't come back. Despite the trauma, I really wanted to also try to capture the strengths and the experience of being in the United States. The participant who stated this quote grew up in Central America and grew up very poor in Central America. And during the interview with this participant, she said that growing up, she remembers when her aunt would send money. Her aunt was in the United States. She said, I remember the day we would get money from my aunt. And I would say, we're gonna eat well, we're gonna have food for the next several weeks because of this money, right, Mom? So she was saying, on the other side of the border, when she was in Central America, how much the remittances meant to her and meant to her family. And now she sends remittances and is grateful to be able to help. So she said, thanks to God that we're here. I always believe this is not our country, and thank God that they gave us the opportunity to be here and to make some money. We can't compare our life there when we were little because we had nothing. It was a hard life, and I see that this is heaven, freedom. Nothing compares. I'm just very happy that this country was able to receive us and that we're able to live comfortably. I just want to be able to do what I can for those that are still in my country. So that goes back again to the remittances. I also want to acknowledge some strengths and sources of resilience among Latino immigrants. And one is the courage to leave their known lives behind. I mentioned the significant impact of loss that can mirror symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. It takes substantial courage and strength to be the family member who migrates to the United States and carries the stress of leaving everyone, of the migration journey, and of having responsibility for supporting family members back home. There's a lot of courage and strength in that. And also to begin a new life here, to offer more to their family in the United States, to be able to bring children and offer more to children here. And then again, the sacrifices to leave loved ones back home. Yes.
How is this different than in the 19th, the early 20th century mass migration from Europe, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Russia? Do you have any?
And in what sense? What context of how is it different?
Those same stresses were around 100, 200 years ago. There were fewer people in the United States. So maybe that's...
We could absorb, the country absorbed it.
But they're in, just say, New York City or Boston, huge communities that were German speaking. They didn't speak any English either, or Irish immigrants didn't speak English really. Their children did sort of the same thing for them in terms of interpreting. I guess, how do you see this compared to that, this state of migration versus that?
I think that there are a lot of similarities, and I think that there are a lot of similarities, especially in terms of the post-migration settlement and navigating life in a new country. So I think that there are a lot of similarities there, and I wouldn't be able to speak enough, so I don't know enough to be able to speak in detail directly to the experiences, but I think the extent of violence in Central America and the fleeing of violence is that so often individuals are not just moving to the United States for a better life, which I think can be a misperception that there are better jobs, there's more money, so I'm going to come to the United States because I can have a better life. From Central America right now, people are fleeing for their lives. They are fleeing because they had a loved one who was killed, or they're fleeing. One of the things I do are mental health assessments for families when a parent is facing deportation, or for asylum cases. And some of the things I've heard are, I came here because my daughter was threatened, her life was threatened, and the only way I felt like we could truly be safe was to flee. So I think that that is one factor, and then definitely some of the policies around and what's going on at the border with the detention camps at the border. Yeah.
I was hoping you would speak to
I will
caging
speak to
of
that.
children at some point.
Yes, yeah. So definitely the detention camps, yes. And the detention camps at the border, and then the separation of parents and children at the border. Again, with some of the assessments I've done and hearing these stories, parents and children can be separated without warning and without any knowledge of where the other one is, any knowledge of how each other are doing, or if or when they could be reunited. There are also, I think, one of the consistent themes that I've heard is, interestingly, out of all the forms of trauma, definitely the separation and not knowing is the biggest. Another one, interestingly, is how cold it is in the detention centers. On concrete floors, no blankets, nothing to stay warm. And many immigrants have never lived in air conditioning and say this air conditioning is just blowing all the time in the room.
It seems like these people are in kind of a push me, pull me situation. They've got intolerable conditions back home, but when they get here,
Yeah.
the fear, it looks like from what I've heard you say, comes largely from their being here illegally.
Yeah.
So they kind of trade one bad situation for another bad situation.
Yeah.
I don't know, is that,
I
am
think-
I seeing that correctly?
I think that's spot on. Trading one bad situation for another bad situation, but the fear, and some families have chosen to go back. Some families have returned, especially to Mexico, some to Central America, but especially to Mexico, have chosen to return. Other families, while living, we know that living with low level stress and fear, and that's not even necessarily low level because we're seeing the raids. We know the raid here in April 2013, the immigration raid, around 100 adults were arrested, around 300 kids had a parent arrested when they got home from school that day. The immigration raid in Mississippi affected 700 families. So we know that these raids are happening. It's a very real fear, but living with that fear and that constant stress level has an impact on physical and mental health. But many families believe that I'm not going to be killed by a gang member and my loved ones aren't, their lives aren't in danger here, so I will choose to risk that, this type of trauma versus that type of trauma. But yeah, it's trading one stressor for another, one stressful life for another.
How can we better that situation?
How much time do we have? About 5 more minutes. Yeah, that gets into a large policy conversation. Just a couple of things that I mean, I would advocate for. One is, and I'll just give a couple of examples. One is when I worked with families right after the raid in East Tennessee and being stationed, a number of the families, as I said, had been here for 18 to 20 years. I think having a path, a true path for legalizing, whether it's citizenship or whatever status we want to have, but legalizing status to be in the United States when somebody has been here for a certain amount of time, kind of like DACA or the DREAM Act, and being able to allow, especially families who have U.S. citizen children. And some of these families had kids who were adolescents or 18-year-olds, almost adults, or were early adults. So I think being able to have a clear, safe path to be here legally. I think also one of the things that we've had in the past are work programs. The Bracero programs in the past with Mexico have allowed individuals to work here legally in the United States. And in that situation, the idea was people come here and work, they help fill the jobs that need to be filled, and then return back home. I'm not saying everybody returned back home, some did, some didn't. So there's that situation. But I think also recognizing that we do have jobs in the United States that only immigrants are going to fill. And we've seen that for, as an example, in Georgia, I think it was around 2010 when the crackdown on immigration happened, and a farm owner was trying to find somebody to work the farm and couldn't. So the crops rotted. The farmers lost a lot of money that year, and immigrants didn't have jobs. And it's really, really hard labor. And for someone who's not used to it in the United States, who is not grown up with that, is going to have a really hard time. So I think recognizing that we have the jobs, and if we can find a legal way to allow filling of those jobs, and then that legal path, especially for folks who have been here a long time. And that's kind of my broad brushstroke answer, but not thorough. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for everything that you shared with us so far. So I'm thinking around like policy level interventions. Do you think it's possible, or to what extent can we advocate for those interventions being trauma informed? So we know that, you know, people who find themselves in these situations are in constant survival mode,
Yes.
fight, flight, freeze, right? But that any policy we provide needs to consider how they're situated, you know, making it trauma informed. So do you think that we're we can make trauma-informed policies, or is that too micro?
That's a good question. No, and I would love to work with a macro person on that. Yes, I think that we can make trauma-informed policies, and we need trauma-informed policies at the policy level. We need trauma-informed policies within systems, whether that's medical systems, school systems, and at the micro level. So yes, I think recognizing that the trauma is there. The trauma has already occurred, and especially in the current environment, the living with the fear that a parent can be arrested, that trauma has already occurred by knowing that that could happen. All of the hundreds, thousands of youth who now have had a parent arrested, that trauma is there. They have been traumatized, and we have to have a very clear way of addressing that trauma, because especially these kids are US citizens. They are our country's responsibility, and they have access to services. So that's going to be really costly to the country to address the physical health repercussions, the mental health repercussions, and the educational repercussions. Please.
Do you know of any of the research on how many kids are left behind, like when their parents deported, and like, because I just think about our social welfare systems and whether or not they're prepared to
Yeah.
that type of fallout.
Yeah, I have that, and I have the number. I'm scared that the number in my head is not accurate, so I don't want to say it, but I will definitely get you that, because no, our child welfare system is absolutely not equipped. I get emails from providers in Tennessee asking for what are the services, because parents have been deported, or we have unaccompanied minors. We have a lot of unaccompanied minors in the United States, and even in Tennessee we do.
If I could ask a question which changes the focus slightly.
Yes.
You're a social worker. I understand that among social workers here in the United States, there is an extremely high burnout level. Could you address some of the reasons for that? Just one or two or three?
Yeah, just in general among social workers?
Yes.
Yeah, that's something, before I even comment on that, I will say that that's something that we really try to address within the education system now to prepare social workers to better take care of themselves. But there has been high burnout, and I will invite my social work colleagues to also speak to this. But the demands, I can just speak from as an example, my own practice experience. When I was practicing, as one example, at a community mental health center, we were required to see a certain number of clients every day. We had a pretty high no-show rate because our clients had the challenges of transportation and working long hours and not always being able to get there. And that gave us no cushion in terms of whether or not I met my productivity criteria. So we were required to double book most of our clients. So if they both showed up, then we're rushing, scrambling. So that's just one example, but I think in general, so that's a very micro example, but I think in general, social workers are working with traumatized individuals, or working with individuals who have had traumatic situations happen and are in very difficult situations, and sometimes situations that cannot be easily resolved because the resources and services aren't there to resolve the situation. So that can be a burden that we also tend to carry, and carry that with us. And
So just to do their required job puts a lot of stress on the social worker him or herself.
Yes.
And over time, I mean, it seems to me that could create a PTSD type
It can.
response in the
Yeah.
person.
It sure can. So
Long-term stress.
Yeah.
Perhaps because of the time.
yes.
Did you need to wrap up, or is?
Oh no, that's we ended on
Maybe
good.
Dr.
So
Nutt could stay for just a few moments if you have additional questions for her. Once again, from all of us, thanks for coming such
Yeah.
a distance for such an important topic. Thank you.
thank you. Thanks.